Yep. Hi everyone. I'm Caleb. As Katerina said, I'm another postdoc here at Utrecht as part of the Visions for the Future project. So we're honoured today to have Joseph Heath join us for this month's speaker series. Joe Heath is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Toronto. His research covers a wide range of fields, including social and political philosophy, philosophy and economics, and business ethics. He's the author of several books, both popular and academic, with his most recent being Ethics for Capitalists, which presents a summary in defense of his market of failures approach to business ethics. I'll now hand it over to Joseph, who'll be presenting on capitalism critique, or Kvetch.
All right. Thank you very much. Yes, everybody hear me? Thanks a lot. I happened to be in Utrecht a month or so ago, and I was talking to Caleb and got a description of what the project is about, and I thought I have this paper that exactly fits in that, because I've been thinking a lot about questions about feasibility, and this paper is basically about how much of an obligation there is to talk about feasible alternatives when developing a critique of capitalism. And so the distinction that is in the title between critique and kvetch kind of comes out of frustrations I've had dealing with graduate students, and in particular dealing with graduate students who have like sort of highly moralized critiques of capitalism that employ extremely strict moral standards. So I'm surrounded by Kantians in Toronto, who often have like extremely demanding expectations of the universe and very strict moral principles. And so when they turn it into a critique of capitalism, it's often struck me as being sort of like shooting fish in the barrel, in the sense that it's not difficult to find ways in which the world falls short of this. So I wanted to kind of have a term for these, what I think is wrong with these highly moralized critiques, and so I came up with this term kvetching, which I'll explain in a sec. But what I would do is like start by drawing a distinction, if I can. Sorry, I'm just like playing around with my thing here. Can I advance my slides and see you all? Let's see. Yes, I can. Okay. So I just want to start with the first of all, the concept of critique. And so like a lot of people in critical theory have this relatively narrow conception of critique. And so here's an example of it from Rahel Yegi, where she says that like in order for a critique of capitalism to be like a critique, it has to be picking out something that's specific to capitalism. And so a critique can fail to be a critique in one of two dimensions. The one, like a critique of capitalism, right? So one, it could pick out features of the system that are just kind of inessential that you could fix, right? And so like if you could fix it with regulation while keeping the basic structure of capitalism intact, then it's not really a critique of capitalism, it's a critique of like some specific problem. But on the other hand, you could or on the side of like kind of over critique, which is that if you've got something that's wrong with capitalism, but it would also be wrong with any other feasible economic system, then again, it's not a critique of capitalism. It's a complaint about the human condition. So in order to articulate it slightly more polemically, I'd rather than want to articulate this as a distinction between critique and kvetching. So kvetching, maybe not everybody knows that word. So that's actually an English word of Yiddish origin, where to kvetch is to complain, but it has a kind of pejorative implication. So like a kvetcher is somebody who's like a chronic complainer and is never satisfied. And so it's a little bit stronger than just complaining. But the goal is to distinguish between a critique of a specific social formation and then a critique of like the human condition, which I want to then redescribe as kvetching. So the structure of the paper is as follows. I want to start by talking about feasibility and what it means to have a feasible alternative to a particular institutional arrangement. And that's actually going to be most of the paper in the presentation. Turns out it's a really difficult question. And then I want to sort of conclude just by talking briefly about why I think so some people could accept the distinction and say, yes, but kvetching about capitalism is nevertheless a useful enterprise. And so I want to say why I'm not persuaded by that view. And then I want to like try to draw some specific conclusions and give some examples of critiques that have been developed in the philosophical literature, or like what people claim are critiques, but I think are actually examples of kvetching. So that a critique of capitalism is actually somewhat harder to develop than many people have thought. So I'll talk about about feasibility, and often like a point of departure for this discussion is this the Harold Demsetz sort of famously in this article criticized what he called the nirvana fallacy as a particular way of criticizing institutions. And so on the left hand side there you have what he criticized as the nirvana approach, which is when you take some existing real world arrangement and you compare it to an ideal, and then you say, aha, it's bad because it falls short of the ideal. And that he considers sort of like unhelpful as far as any sort of real world politics is concerned, simply because every institution is going to fall short of an ideal to some degree. So then he argues that the only interesting way to do institutional analysis, therefore, is to take two different institutions and kind of measure the distance that they each have from the ideal, and then to recommend one or the other based on how closely it approximates the ideal. So this is sort of Demsetz's sort of well-known analysis, and it has sort of a problem to it, which is that it excludes what I think is probably the most common type of institutional critique. And so he says that what you always have to be engaged in is comparative institutional analysis. And like there is obviously like a correct point there, which is that like when considering different institutional options, you want to be comparing things at the same level of idealization. And so if you're kind of mixing and matching the level of idealization, then it's not going to be helpful to be criticizing an institution by comparing it to something at a completely different level. So you want to make sure you're consistent in your level of idealization. But what he ignores is something which is what most people do when they're engaged in institutional critique, is that I mean, when they're doing a good job of it, so not committing the nirvana fallacy, the way in which we criticize institutions is by developing a proposal which we take to be at the same level of idealization as the existing institutions, but which is not necessarily, already instantiated somewhere in the world. And we compare the institution to like a proposal. This is sort of arbitrarily excluded by Demsetz's setup, so I want to kind of defend it, obviously, because that's what most of what we do consists in. But I just want to then identify that though as the source of the problems that I want to talk about, because it is important when formulating these proposals that they be at the same level of idealization as the institutions that we're criticizing. And what sometimes happens in the way in which people formulate proposals is that they build in such optimistic assumptions into the proposal that what they're really doing is comparing an existing institution to the ideal, right? In other words, like the proposal is actually just the ideal masquerading as a real proposal. And so in order to do this kind of critique without committing the nirvana fallacy, we have to be sort of disciplined in the way in which we develop our proposals. So that's what gives rise to this concern about feasibility, right? So that a proposal needs to be that's what most often gets articulated. What you want is a proposal that's at the appropriate level of idealization for the institutions that you're criticizing. The way in which we often articulate that is by saying the proposal needs to be feasible, as a way of drawing the contrast between an ideal, which is often not feasible directly. So that leads to like my major topic, which is I want to talk about feasibility. So I should say, so there's a long-standing debate with respect to the issue of the critique of capitalism. There's a long-standing debate about feasible socialism amongst people of a more sort of political economy stripe. So Alec Nova's book, The Economics of a Feasible Socialism, in the dying days of the Soviet Union, sparked a huge discussion and kind of like gave a name to a particular kind of debate. There hasn't been nearly as much philosophical reflection on feasibility until recent years. So like the sort of economics debate about feasible socialism was longstanding. And philosophers only got interested, as far as I can see, in the issue in the last 20 years or so, even though it obviously plays such a huge role in sort of polemics around capitalism. Um, so like Jeffrey Brennan and Nick Southwood's article, and then Pablo Gilibert and Holly Lawford Smith's papers and so on sort of started philosophical reflection on feasibility. I have to say what I learned from that literature was kind of that I didn't really understand feasibility, or that feasibility is actually a very, very difficult concept. So I'm hoping not to talk too long about it. So it's a little bit of a rabbit hole. So I'm actually going to talk mainly about feasibility. Um, and hopefully not talk too long about it. But so there's clearly three things going on when we discuss feasibility. And so which I have outlined here. So on the one hand, there's some concept of what's possible and what's impossible. Um, but then, as many people have pointed out, there is an agential constraint on possibility. So in other words, what's feasible is not the same as just what's possible. There's also a sense that it's like doable in addition to being possible, because there's lots of things that are possible, but where there's no route to get from where we are now to there, right? So there's a practical obstacle to its achievement. Um, and so it's like really common for people then to take a feasibility to be a concept that incorporates this combination of possibility and practicability, but then to distinguish feasibility from desirability. So like Jerry Cohen, for example, in Why Not Socialism, says there's feasibility and there's desirability. Like these are the two constraints, without a great deal of analysis of feasibility. Um, and I'm actually not so sure about that. So there's definitely these three distinct notions, and there's ways in which people use the concept of feasibility that clearly are invoking either of these three. So an issue of possibility, doability, so desirability is not as separate from feasibility as it's often taken to be. So what I've found, and what I want to suggest is that, one of the things that the literature has sort of clearly established is that if you scratch the surface of debates about possibility, what you often discover is that what's really at stake is an issue around practicability. So is it doable? But that also, but what I want to suggest is that if you scratch the surface of debates about practicability, what you often find is a question about desirability. So I'm this close to thinking we should just stop talking about feasibility because it's so ambiguous between these three different sets of constraints, and maybe we should just talk about possibility, practicability, and desirability. But what I definitely want to suggest is that the debates about feasible socialism are almost all they almost all turn into a debate about desirability. They're not really about possibility and practicability. Um, so my thought then, so I'm going to just go through these and explain how they become complicated, and then they kind of turn into a discussion of the other issue. So the first thing about so for something to be feasible, it has to be possible. It can't be impossible. And so impossibility represents a sort of a preliminary filter on feasibility. We want to rule out things that are impossible. Um, Impossibility, however, uh, for anybody who's done like the modal semantics, but that's not everybody, knows that there's a kind of contextual element to what we mean when we talk about something being impossible, or when we talk about something being possible or something being necessary. There's always a kind of implicit scope restriction on that notion. And so the simple way to articulate it is in terms of the well-known Kripke semantics for modal operators, which articulates it in terms of a set of possible worlds. So what you do is you want to say, like, here in my little circle here, I got the set of possible worlds. And then the actual world is one of this very, very large set of possible worlds. Um, and then so Kripke famously has sort of pointed out that you can provide a semantics for the modal operators like impossibility or necessity by quantifying over these possible worlds. So if something is impossible, that means it's false at all possible worlds. But if you say all possible worlds, uh, 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 like literally the entire set of possible worlds, that doesn't define a very interesting concept of possibility. And so normally, and the Kripke's approach was to impose a scope restriction, which is to define an accessibility relation, where you want to say, well, it's not every possible world, but it's every possible world that sort of shares certain features with our own. And so the one that like logicians are interested in then are the set of possible worlds that have the same laws of logic as our own world. Um, and then if you want to say, well, something is impossible, what that means, if you say something's logically impossible, what that means is that the statement is false at all possible worlds that share the same laws of logic as our own. Right? So that's the notion of logical necessity, logical possibility. In scientific contexts, we often then talk about a notion of physical, like what's physically possible. And there, what we're doing is tacitly restricting the set of possible worlds to those that have the same laws of nature as our own. So the same gravitational constant, stuff like that. Not, I mean, so those are the conceptions of possibility and necessity that are most relevant in the natural sciences. Uh, in the social sciences, we obviously restrict it even further, and so we often restrict it to like worlds that have the same history as our own up to the present, including the same evolutionary history. And then we quantify over just those worlds. But when debating institutional reform, we impose like an either another restriction, and this is the one that obviously causes the most problems and the greatest ambiguity, is when we want to talk about things that are possible given certain kinds of constraints of human nature or human psychology. Um, and how we want to understand that then becomes a source of enormous ambiguity in debates about feasibility. Okay, so there are all these different concepts of possibility. So feasibility is often ambiguous between notions of possibility, practicability, and desirability. But then if you take even just one of them, possibility, you discover that there's different concepts of possibility depending on what kind of accessibility relation you're assuming. Um, and so already and possibility is probably the clearest of the concepts that feeds into feasibility, but even possibility harbors significant ambiguity. So then the question is like, how much do various notions of possibility, like how much work do they do when thinking about feasible socialism, um, and what's impossible? So I think that there's like a couple proposal, like there's maybe one proposal that could be ruled out using a weak concept of possibility, and that would be like a very naive version of the community of associated producers line. Right? So like if you have a critique of capitalism that is unhappy about markets, and your proposal is, well, rather than having markets decide things, I mean, Marx used some language like this. The community of associated producers will get together, right? So you imagine just like a completely democratic process where people just deliberate about what we're going to produce, right? That one comes close to being ruled out, I think, by like a laws of nature conception of possibility, and maybe like history up to the present. Like that one's impossible using a very, very minimal set of constraints. And the reason being, just the usual sort of calculation problem. So like Nova gives a really good example of this, of the complexity of the problem, where he points out that so in the heyday of the Soviet Union, like sort of before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, um, the heroic bureaucrats of Gosplan had the obligation to calculate how much of everything to produce in the entire Soviet economy. And as everyone knows, it was like a Herculean task. But just to illustrate the task, an example that Nova gives is that so in the late 80s, the Soviet economy produced 1,000 different sizes and grades of ball bearings. Right? So like ball bearings are like an incredibly important part of a variety of different machines. Like ball bearings are all around us, right? So everything from your skateboard to your automobile to a piece of industrial machinery, right? Everything uses ball bearings. Ball bearings are made in different sizes, and ball bearings also, because they support weight, are made from different grades of steel and also out of different materials. And you don't want to use your highest quality steel in ball bearings that are going into children's skateboards, right? Stuff like that, right? So ball bearings, like if you pop the lid on an industrial economy, and we're talking about like only a moderately complex industrial economy, but you pop the lid, and what you discover is that like the number of decisions that need to be made is just sort of mind-boggling. So in the Soviet Union, there were actually people who decided uh, how many of each, how like what the quantity of each grade of ball bearing would be produced by the Soviet economy, adding up to like over 1,000 different unique decisions about ball bearings. Now, of course, what makes that decision complicated is the fact that it's completely interdependent with every other decision being made in the economy. And not only that, the decision you make about a particular ball bearing is actually interdependent with some of the other decisions that you're making elsewhere about ball bearings. So to answer the ball bearing question, you can't just sequentially go through the ball bearings and decide how many to make. It has to be in equilibrium, right? Because the machines that make steel have ball bearings in them. So if you decide to make more of this kind of ball bearing, it's gonna change what you need to say about other ball bearings and so on, right? Okay, so that's just a way of illustrating the mind-boggling complexity of the calculation problem, and So when you say, oh, the workers are just going to get together and decide democratically, like that's close to being like impossible in a really like minimal modal sense, right? That like, well, whatever. Okay, so but then here's another example of a view that's often taken to be impossible, which is Marx's conception of full communism, at which post-scarcity conditions will be achieved. Right? So, like the idea of post-scarcity communism, comes up every so often, but most people regard that as being infeasible on the grounds that it's impossible. And the reason it's often thought to be impossible is due to the observation made by Veblen and then Fred Hirsch, that an enormous amount of people's consumption is geared towards attaining social status. So it's instrumental to attaining social status, and therefore satiation is impossible. And then Hirsch made the observation in addition to that, that not only that, but some goods are like intrinsically fixed in supply. And as a result, you simply can't make more of them. And so there's always going to be scarcity, whether it's like socially induced or materially induced. There's a kind of conceptual impossibility to overcoming scarcity. So that's often presented as a kind of, therefore it's impossible to plan socialism on the assumption that there's going to be no scarcity. But like that argument still depends on certain assumptions about human psychology. And in particular, depends upon the assumption that people care about social status. And so, for example, so like the Veblen concern is assuming something like human psychology, kind of as it is now, is a relevant constraint when thinking about what's possible. But of course, it's always possible that you could fundamentally change human psychology in such a way that people stop caring about social status. Or instead of competing with one another for positional goods, you could change human psychology in such a way in which people come to start lovingly sharing with their neighbors rather than wanting to have like their own like beachfront estate or something like that, right? So like, so you can imagine transformations of human psychology that would make it possible. And so and a lot of the debates, like fruitless debates about feasible socialism, come down to that this question of how optimistic people are willing to be about modifications to human psychology. Now, the major observation I want to make about that is that that question often turns into, therefore, a question about doability, not so much a question about possibility, right? Because we all know that human psychology is modifiable to a certain extent, but that is also kind of stubbornly resistant to change to a certain extent. And so often the extent to which we're willing to countenance changes in human psychology kind of depends on how much we want to socialize individuals, right? Or like how much effort we want to invest in encouraging people to develop certain kinds of personality structures and so forth, right? So in other words, I think that that's a good example, because so much of the debate about socialism comes down to this question of how much psychology constrains possibility, and psychology is modifiable to a certain degree. It then turns into like, so this is the example I was trying to say of like how what looks like a debate about possibility actually turns into a debate about doability. So that takes us then to the second issue, right? Then, which is the second component of feasibility, which is what's practicable. And here, all right, so like I said, this is kind of a rabbit hole. Maybe I'm spending too much time talking about this, so I'll go maybe a little faster. But so the question of what's doable, it's an odd literature because it's a sort of super technical literature, but one of the peculiarities of the literature is that every like it's very analytic, and so like people like to say, oh, here's my definition of what's practicable, or what's feasible, and then they try to give out like they indent it and they give necessary and sufficient conditions for what's practicable. But all of the major formulations in the literature are all individualistic. That is, that they articulate what's doable in terms of what an agent can do, like an individual agent can accomplish, which is a weird way of formulating it. But it's certainly not the formulation that we're most interested in when we talk about feasible socialism, where we're typically talking about large-scale social transformation that kind of by definition an individual agent is not able to bring about, right? But rather we collectively have to bring it about. So like Holly Lawford Smith is a good example of it, where like in her papers, she get like the papers on the subject, she gives it this individualistic formulation. But then when talking about it politically, so like in gender critical feminism, when talking about it politically, she actually gives this collective formulation of it, right? So here's her kind of informal collective formulation of it. She says, something's feasible if we'd be reasonably likely to succeed in bringing about if we tried. Um, and I just think it's kind of obvious that like the we there is sort of a problem. Like though, if we tried, we could do it, right? Um, this kind of begs the question about like what you mean by tried. The concept of what it means for an individual to try is pretty coherent. But what it means for us to try is ambiguous because it doesn't really say anything about how we're treating collective action problems. Right. So, for example, if I were to say, right, so what did I say here? Yeah, raise an obvious question about collective action problem. So if I were to say, look, here's my plan for resolving climate change, which is that all of us are going to privately and voluntarily reduce our carbon emissions, and by like voluntarily cutting back our consumption, and that's my plan. Now, a lot of people would look at that and say, "Oh, that's not feasible." Um, and there's going to have to be some kind of legal structure. There's going to have to be international agreements and stuff like that. No, I'm saying no. Everybody should just do their part through their private consumption decisions. That's my plan. I think it'd be reasonable to say, well, that's not feasible. But on on the Lawford Smith definition, that is feasible because if we tried, we could do it that way, right? It's just that there's obviously serious difficulties around getting everybody to just try that way. So I think what's missing, and I'd be happy to get references if there are people who have addressed this issue, but it's something that I haven't really found a lot of discussion in that literature, of how to get from that individualistic formulation of practicability to this collective formulation. And it seems to be that the central issue there is around collective action problems. And that's what's going to be relevant around debates around socialism as well, right? Like all these economic systems are institutionally trying to mediate collective action problems. And so obviously there's lots of forms of socialism that would work if we tried, but in a way that involves just sort of wishing away collective action problems. But if you think people are going to remain vulnerable to collective action problems, then that becomes the central question around feasibility. So what I want to say, though, is that to answer, I don't see how you answer that question without then invoking issues around desirability. Right. So the same way issues around possibility turned into these issues around practicability, I think because of this collective action problem issue, the questions around practicability actually turn into questions about desirability. And the reason is that if you look at how we organize, like how we human beings organize to resolve collective action problems, um, we do so through a combination of internal, like intrinsic motivation, but also external motivation. Right. So the way that we try is by, on the one hand, giving people arguments and values and reasons to do their part, right? So trying to engage their moral motivations. But we also introduce a coercive apparatus whereby we then punish people for not doing it. So that's exactly what we do on climate change and so on. Right? That's why there's a policy dimension to it, is because we have like an external coercive apparatus for cases in which, as a complement to people's intrinsic motives. And it seems to me that like you can't answer either question then. I mean, so like what can we actually accomplish if we try depends a lot on, first of all, the kinds of intrinsic motives that are going to be available, but also how much coercion we're willing to apply to people. And that then comes down to a question of desirability. And so, like you could see it with the case of COVID, like when you're trying to get everybody to stay in their house for like a week on end, there's like a clear question then that arises about how much coercion you're willing to use in order to accomplish that objective. And different states around the world had different tolerances for the level of coercion, and therefore were able to achieve different levels of compliance with public health measures. Um, and so that becomes a question. So what's feasible really does turn into a question about what's desirable, where a crucial feature of desirability is how much coercion you're willing to employ. All right. So I think that therefore this practicability stuff turns into a desirability issue. Um, and that also is, like really central with debates over socialism and feasible socialism. And so here's how I then I think we should think about this question of desirability. So the feasible socialism debate kind of turns into a debate about desirability. And the best way to approach the desirability issue then is to think about like what are the traditional ambitions of the socialist project. Um, and so I sort of sketch out like a list of goals of sort of things that people have traditionally wanted. So like how do you think about desirable socialism then? Um, and so I have this list here. This is not necessarily exhaustive, but these are like a list of good things that I think socialists have traditionally thought that you could get, right? Um, and think of these as kind of like Isaiah Berlin style values that are, every political system is going to have to trade them off against each other in some respect, right? So here are things that socialists have traditionally wanted or promised. So first of all, efficiency, which is that, understood broadly, which is that the goal is to preserve the division of labor and the relative affluence of our society. Second, equality, obviously. Third is that there's an expectation of ongoing progress, so that there's still going to be like developments in science and technology, but also in the arts and in philosophy and in literature, right? We're going to, continue to produce good things. Four, that there's going to be like a reasonable level of personal freedom. So, certain kinds of consumer, like it's not going to be like an army base, like certain kinds of consumer choice are still going to be respected. But also that there's like at least a hope and expectation of non-coerciveness, which is not the same thing as personal freedom, right? But it's just like that any of the rules are there, there's going to be a relatively high level of voluntary compliance on the part of the population. And then finally, some kind of solidarity or community that by eliminating the competitiveness of the market, you're going to have enhanced social solidarity. All right, so I think that these are the sort of traditional goals, and all I want to suggest is that like when we talk about feasible socialism, if one is not committed to these goals or all of these goals, it's quite easy to come up with socialist blueprints that are feasible in the sense that they're both possible and there's something we could do. The objection to them, the problem with them, like what rules them out, is the fact that they perform terribly with respect to one of these or one or more of these traditional ambitions. Um, so, like an example of this is, in Mark Fisher's book Capitalist Realism, which all my undergraduates have read and loved. But the subtitle of the book is Capitalist Realism: Is There No Alternative? And he has this sort of famous line that he attributes to like Zizek and Jameson, but I think it's actually he kind of made it up, which is that he says it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And people think that's a great line or whatever, but I always find it kind of puzzling because, like that's not really true. Like it's easy to imagine the end of capitalism. Like, go to North Korea. There's no capitalism there, right? There's lots of places where there's no capitalism. Um, and you can certainly the end of the world would entail the end of capitalism. Like what's hard to imagine is an end to capitalism that individuals in currently capitalist societies would voluntarily adopt or transition to, right? And so we talk, and similarly, like there is no alternative. Like there's lots of alternatives. The problem is better alternatives, right? Like that's the problem. There's lots of worse alternatives. And so like what I find striking about that book is like he writes a whole book complaining about nobody's got any alternative, and then the book just stops, right? And then he has like no alternative, right? Um, uh, Again, like that, the obvious challenge is to come up with a better alternative, and so even so, it's formulated in terms of like as though it's a modal question, right, about what's possible, but really it's just a question about what's desirable, kind of masquerading as a question about what's possible. Um, so like here's how I would like suggest we think about it. Um, which is that, so take the traditional goals, and then you can just kind of score economic systems by how well they do in these different dimensions. So I don't want to go to bat for this. I just like, if I was just sort of pulling some numbers out of my or some grades, I would say like, capitalism probably looks something like this. Where like I think most people would say it's pretty good on the efficiency and progress dimension, okay on personal freedom and non-coerciveness, and then probably worst on equality and solidarity. But you could argue about any of those. So certainly, like the goals of socialist transformation is to improve on the equality and the solidarity dimensions. Like people really pick up on the things on which capitalism performs worst. And then I've just got a bunch of question marks because the whole challenge is to come up with a system that does reasonably well in the other dimensions. And so that I think is what generates the current landscape of discussions around feasible socialism, which is that like what does it mean to be infeasible here, right? To have an infeasible socialism would be to have a proposal that maybe gives you like the A on equality and solidarity, but gives you like that completely tanks the score in some other dimension, right? So something that gives you like an F on efficiency, taking you back to like pre-industrial era or something like that, would probably regard it as infeasible because it's so outside that like one score is so low that it's kind of a deal breaker for people, right? Or also like non-coerciveness, right? So you could have like a totalitarian socialism that would have a lot of equality and solidarity, but would be ridiculously coercive. And then that would be like a deal breaker. So people would consider that infeasible. And then the other possibility is you could have a form of socialism that was dominated, and so that it simply did worse in every dimension than certain forms of capitalism. And I think that would also be infeasible. Um, and then you would distinguish that from undesirable by undesirable is just stuff that has like a mixed score so that it's controversial. And so some people dislike it. But it's not infeasible in the sense that there's nothing deal breaking in the proposal. So this is my sort of proposed like reformulation of this vocabulary, which is to basically treat all of it as a normative question. Um, and the empirical stuff informs our understanding of what the trade-offs are. But the distinction between feasibility and desirability is actually a distinction in how we're normatively assessing proposals for feasible socialism. Uh, okay, I'm sorry, I keep bumping my microphone. How long have I been talking, by the way? Sorry, was anyone keeping track?
I think about 30 minutes. I don't know if
30 minutes. Oh, okay. So I'm okay. I can relax. All right. So that was my thoughts on feasibility, which I mean, I still like a little bit underdeveloped. And so like obviously I'd be interested in feedback on that question. But I think it was with some issues there's the possibility and the practicability is relevant and important. But I think with a lot of these debates around capitalism and socialism and the critique of capitalism, like it all just boils down to normative assessment. So I guess I'm developing what I call like a normative theory of feasibility. And then it's often just misleading to talk about it in terms of feasibility. Okay. Um, so then the question is, so kvetching then is when people are developing a moral critique of capitalism, where they don't have a morally attractive alternative to present as an alternative to it. Um, and so what I diagnose with some of my students and some of the people I work with, right, is applying such strict normative standards to the evaluation of capitalism that no economic system could possibly satisfy those standards, and so then it becomes something of an idle complaint. Um, now, so some people have explicitly defended that practice, and so Nick Frusalis is a good example of this, of someone who like thinks that kvetching is like so. Some people's inclination when I present this is to deny that they're kvetching and say no, I'm doing a critique. But others have chosen to double down on kvetching and say no, like kvetching is a worthwhile activity, right? So Nick is a principled defender of kvetching, where he simply doesn't think it's his job to come up with any kind of proposal for what could replace capitalism. It's still a valuable exercise to identify the moral flaws in the system. And so his argument is like a little underdeveloped because he thinks his position is so self-evident that it doesn't really require an argument. So here's what he says. So he says that some have claimed that in order to understand what is intrinsically unjust about capitalist economic structure, we must not ask only what a putatively unjust feature is necessarily present in it. We must also show that this feature is not necessarily present in other feasible social systems, such as socialism. Failure in the comparative exercise is tantamount to failure in critique itself. The mooted claim is demonstrably false. Critique is not necessarily comparative. Being locked in a cage for no good reason is unjust, even if there exists no feasible state involving cagelessness. And some injustices may be irremediable, inevitable, or even necessary. All right. So obviously that's a little bit underdeveloped. Like he says, demonstrably false. I want to hear more about that. But so I think that this argument or this claim kind of hinges on ambiguity in how the concept of feasibility is being understood. Because if one is understanding feasibility in modal, like in terms of so there's no feasible state involving cagelessness. If that means that it's that you necessarily are in the cage, um, then it just doesn't seem to me that unjust is the right word to describe it. Right. So there's like no possible world in which you're not encaged. Then it seems to me like it's like justice is the wrong term. You're kind of complaining about the human condition or a state of affairs, right? Like it's kind of like complaining about bipedalism or something like that, where like it's all kinds of like back pain is associated with being bipedal, but there's no like it's necessary, like there's no evolutionary history that it allows us to escape from bipedalism, and therefore we're stuck with it, right? But it's not like an injustice of the human condition that we're bipedal. um okay, so if what he really means is something like about, so if the way in which feasibility is being understood then though involves practicability, that one I have to think about a little bit more. But it's kind of like, oh, you're in a cage, but we can't let you out. Like we can't, we can't get you out of the cage. Like it's not possible to get you out of the cage or something like that. That would be a different and complicated sense, right? But if it's this normative desirability sense, um, then I think that the argument kind of plays on a sort of ambiguity between sort of pro tanto and all things considered uses of the term unjust. Um, so like if you're using it in the all things considered sense, um, then well, I mean, what's the right way to articulate it? I haven't found exactly the right way to articulate this sense, right? It's that if you're saying like on balance, like the reason why you can't come out of the cage is that on balance, all things considered, it's best for you to be in the cage. That is clearly question begging to describe that as an injustice. Right? Then it means it's not unjust for you to be in the cage because all things considered, on the balance of reasons, like you need to remain in the cage. But so if you're using it, so it's just question begging if you're using it in the all things considered sense. If you're using it in a pro tanto sense, and you're saying, oh yeah, well, like, it's a bad thing that you're in the cage, but there's all these other considerations that speak in favor of you remaining in the cage. Then again, like that it's not clear what gets like what the force is of pointing out that it's unjust. All right, so there's like, so my first then complaint about kvetching is that it tends to confuse or hinge on like a confusion of a sort of pro tanto and all things considered sense of those terms. And so um, and this is particularly prominent when it comes to critiques of capitalism, whereby people will point out what they take to be like injustices in the capitalist system, or just like sort of bad features of the capitalist system. Um, but um, you know, like sophisticated defenders of the system are simply not committed to denying that the system has those unjust qualities. In other words, like most sophisticated defenders of the market are defending it in from a sort of all things considered perspective that is not committed to denying that it generates certain kinds of injustices or negative features. So like so for example, like so Friedrich Hayek freely admits that the distribution produced by capitalism would be unjust if it was the product of an intentional process. So, like, if an organization got together and chose to allocate the benefits and burdens of cooperation in the way in which the market does, it would be unproblematic, he says, to describe that as an unjust system. Right? But it's not produced through such a mechanism, right? It's the product of a spontaneous order. And there are other reasons why we might want to have a spontaneous order. Right? And so the defense of the market is clearly an all things considered defense that does not deny the distributive injustice of the system. Right? So there's other people who like have similar kinds of arguments, right? So there are utopian defenses of capitalism, but a lot of the more sophisticated defenders of it are doing a sort of all things considered justification, and so it simply doesn't speak to that to point out like a particular injustice. what you need to show is that that injustice is not like, outweighed by other considerations, like, so you have to move to the all things considered level. And if you're not doing that, so if you just point out one injustice and therefore conclude capitalism is unjust, you're illegitimately jumping then from a pro tanto to an all things considered judgment. So that's the first concern that I have about kvetching. And then the second thing, and this is more like a little ad hominem on Nick, right? But it's also like, I just don't believe these people when they say they're not concerned about feasibility because of the principles that they choose, right? So if you take Versailles as an example, I mean, he's using like a neo-Republican non-domination standard as his normative principle, but non-domination is like an extremely undemanding standard to assess an institution by. And so if you're not concerned about feasibility, why would you choose non-domination, right? Like asking people not to dominate each other is an extremely minimal request, right? And it doesn't correspond to anybody's like stricter moral convictions, right? So why are you using such a weak standard to criticize capitalism if you're not trying to fix it? Like if you're not worried about the creation of an economic system that wouldn't dominate people, why is that the standard? Because there's lots of critiques of capitalism that use like much, much more demanding standards. So like Barry Maguire would be an example of like someone who criticizes capitalism because it impedes our ability to care for one another, right? Now, obviously, that's a lot more demanding than not dominating each other, right? But also like, there's like lots of Christian polemics against capitalism, right? Like if we're asking people to care for each other, why not follow Jesus and ask people to love one another, right? And capitalism maybe interferes with our ability to love one another, right? And so like that is, we can come up with all kinds of standards that capitalism fails egregiously to satisfy. Now, I mean, if we're not concerned about fixing these problems, but we're just identifying moral flaws, like why wouldn't we use these more demanding standards? So I think there's a kind of like implicit tension in people taking very like undemanding and very political, in the Rawlsian sense, like very political normative standards, and then claiming not to be concerned about feasibility when clearly the normative standard they've chosen is one that they think should be satisfiable, right? But then they simply fail to say how they think it could be satisfied. So that's my sort of complaint about kvetch, my kvetch about kvetching. And then I guess the last thing I want to say is that, like,
just quickly, Joe, just telling you 5 more minutes.
Yeah, great. So this is like the wrap up, is to say when you go in the philosophical literature, like, and you look for a critique of capitalism, I just think a lot of what you find is kvetching. And so an example of this, one that's kind of always bugged me, was so Cohen's little story about his father losing his job at the end of If You're So Rich, where he kind of tells his story, and it's like it's a little like I'm kind of bothered by the way he tells the story, in part because it's also imprecise the way he tells it, even though obviously Cohen was capable of being very precise. He tells it in this very sort of odd way. But basically, his father got laid off because of declining demand for the. So his father was a dressmaker, dress cutter, and there was declining demand for that particular product. And so he was let go. He was fired because he was specialized in the production of a particular product. And so then Cohen has this like very polemical way of describing what was wrong with it, and the way in which his father was treated was sort of inhumane because of the market norm that says that you have to satisfy market demand. And so one of the things that's always sort of bothered me about this story is that is that I think it's a kvetch, right? And the reason I think it's kvetching is because if you look at like what exactly is the feature of capitalism that resulted in this negative outcome for Maury, the answer is that the feature of capitalism that resulted in this outcome is the fact that it institutionalizes a division of labor through a system of reciprocity. In other words, the problem here that Cohen is complaining about is the division of labor, right? So like what a division of labor means is that rather than producing, your own food, your own water, your own housing, right? We adopt complementary specializations. So what someone like Maury specializes in producing dresses, right? Which, for other people. And the way in which we make that sustainable then is by instituting a system of cooperation whereby we reciprocate. And so I produce philosophy for my students, and then they pay tuition, and then I go out and buy my lunch, et cetera, right? So everyone knows the contours of that. But what it means, because it's a system of reciprocity, is that what you produce is going to be, you can't determine unilaterally what you get to do. Rather, it's determined by what other people want. And so if other people, so if women's taste in dresses changes, resulting in a lack of demand for the dresses that Mori is producing, then Mori has no entitlement to continue to produce those things, right? So you're part of engaging in a system of cooperation is you become at least partially beholden to the changing tastes and preferences of other people. And so, particularly when you're in a consumer market and producing something for others, you become sort of beholden to changes in their consumption tastes, right? And so, so what he's complaining about here is not so much capitalism, but rather the way in which capitalism institutionalizes a division of labor. And therefore, the burden of proof is to show that there's some other way in which you could organize a division of labor that wouldn't generate this problem. But I simply don't see like how that could be. Okay? That under socialism, it's also going to be the case that people are going to have to change jobs, right? Even when they're old, if demand for a particular product changes. So you could quibble about the specific ways in which Mori got fired and the fact that he wasn't necessarily offered replacement employment. I mean, like there's lots of quibbles you could have about this story, right? But the basic complaint that Cohen's making here is simply not an objection to capitalism. It's an objection to having a division of labor in society. And that then is obviously going to be a complaint about any feasible form of socialism. All right. So the one thing I will say about Cohen, though, was that he at least rejected market socialism, and so his conception of socialism was one in which you would have no system of competitive determination of prices whatsoever, and so there's a sense in which, like, obviously there was a burden of proof there of showing how that's supposed to work. But that freed him up to complain about a lot of things in capitalism um, that others, I think, are not entitled to complain about. Why? Because he rejected like the market in its entirety. Whereas the more common position for people to take is nowadays is like a market socialist position, whereby people have complaints about various aspects of capitalism, but their conception of socialism is still going to have a decentralized competitive determination of prices. All right, so like John Rome or whatever, like most people are market socialists. And I think that once you become a market socialist, then I think this distinction between critique and kvetch actually starts to really, really cut. Because I think most of what people complain about in capitalism is a consequence of the market, not private ownership of the means of production. So I think that most of the blueprints for market socialism preserve most of the flaws or like the moral objections that people have to capitalism would also be present in a market socialist society. And so I just have I'll end with like a fast list of things that if you're a market socialist, here are things that you cannot critique in capitalism. You can kvetch about them, but you're kvetching because if you're a market socialist, you intend to keep them, right? And so if you intend to keep these things, you should not be complaining about them as features of capitalism. So number one, you cannot critique commodification because a market socialist society would obviously still have markets and therefore commodities. Um, Exploitation in the narrow Marxian sense is not really something that you can criticize because you still intend for there to be private savings and for people to be paid a return on their savings and so forth, right? So there's still going to be exploitation under market socialism. Alienation, depending on how you define it, but most definitions of alienation are still going to be present under market socialism. You're not going to be producing for yourself. There's still going to be a vast division of labor, and you're going to be producing mainly in order to earn your wages. Um, there's obviously still going to be profit seeking, right? So cooperatives are profit seeking organizations, just like corporations. So you can't be overly exercised about profits. Obviously, you can't complain about competition because competition is what's going to cause prices to move to market clearing levels. So you have to kind of make your peace with competition. Um, and then finally, you can't be too worried about externalities because obviously, as long as you have the decentralized operations of the price system, economic actors are still going to have incentives to produce externalities. And then also, if you have markets, you're still going to have recessions. You're still going to have a monetary system, so you're still going to have recessions. You're still going to have unemployment. You're still going to have all these things, right? And so these are all things that, if you're a market socialist, wind up being kvetches. So I should say that. So none of this is so. What I actually think a critique of capitalism is winds up just a lot narrower than many people take it to be. But I don't want to be discouraging. I want to say, in part, this is like background. Like, so this is why I do business ethics, right? That is that I think that that what there's a lot of complaints one can have morally about the way in which people act within capitalist systems, and that business ethics, encouraging people to act more ethically within the context of capitalism, is a productive use of time. But identifying those moral flaws is not the same as developing a critique of capitalism. And developing a critique of capitalism, like in the modern sort of like age, with the level of understanding we have about the weaknesses of central planning and the way in which markets work, right? Developing an actual critique of capitalism is an extraordinarily difficult project, one that I've given up on, but I don't want to necessarily, say that everybody has to give up on. All right, thank you.
Yes, as a golf clap. Great, thank you very much, Joe. So we'll now turn to questions. So yeah, if you could use the raise hand function, I'll create a list, and then maybe just leave your hand up until you're called upon, just to ensure I've captured everybody. Jamie.
I actually meant to to clap, but I pressed the wrong button. But I do have one quick thing, which is just on the concept of feasibility, which is that there's an interesting and friendly, I think, paper coming out that bears some affinities to the conception of feasibility that you've articulated here shortly in ethics by a former colleague of mine, Halvard Sandven, which kind of makes the case that claims about feasibility and moral and
Sorry, you said the name really fast. Can you say the name slowly?
Halvard Sandven.
Okay.
And he kind of makes the case that claims about feasibility are always